We know now that Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, myths, hymns, laments, and so-called wisdom literature.
A dying scholar pressed his cracked lips together, stared at the ceiling of his hospital room, and whispered words that would haunt every person in that room for the rest of their lives. Dr. Samuel Noah Kramer, the man who had spent 60 years decoding the oldest written language on Earth, had something urgent to confess. Not about religion, not about politics, about history itself. About the story the entire modern world had been getting catastrophically wrong for over a century. He said, "We've been lying to the world about the Sumerians, and time is running out to fix it." The people around him went pale because they knew exactly what he meant.
We should finally come to grips with the idea that extraterrestrials had something to do with our development.
They had read the tablets. They had seen the discoveries pile up. They had watched the evidence quietly accumulate for decades. And they understood that what was buried in ancient clay 4,000 years ago was about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about the origins of human civilization. The forgotten first. Most people hear the words ancient civilization and instantly picture Egypt. Giant pyramids, mysterious mummies, dramatic pharaohs staring into the distance like they're posing for a history textbook cover. But here's the twist. Nobody really emphasized in school. Egypt wasn't the first great civilization. Sumer was. And Dr. Kramer knew this better than almost anyone alive. Around 4,500 BCE, more than 6,000 years ago, a group of people settled in a brutally hot region between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq. They called their land Kayengi, which roughly meant the land of the noble lords. Later, the Greeks gave the region a different name, Mesopotamia, literally the land between the rivers. And while it might have looked like nothing but flat, dusty plains to outsiders, something extraordinary was happening there. These people didn't just build houses or farms. They built civilization itself. Cities suddenly appeared. Real cities. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. These weren't tiny villages with a few huts and a wandering goat. Uruk, for example, exploded into a massive urban center. By around 3,200 BCE, it had nearly 80,000 people living inside its walls. At that moment in time, that made it the largest city on Earth, thousands of years before Rome, London, or New York even existed. And these weren't crude settlements. Uruk had monumental temples, organized districts, professional craftsmen, merchants, and priests, a functioning economy with standardized weights and measures, long-distance trade networks stretching hundreds of miles, obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Iran. The Sumerians weren't isolated, they were connected. They were building the blueprint every civilization after them would follow. And then they did something that changed human history forever. They invented writing, not cave paintings, not random symbols scratched on rocks. Actual structured writing, a full language system pressed into wet clay tablets using a sharpened reed stylus. The script was called cuneiform, and it contained more than 900 distinct signs. With it, the Sumerians recorded everything: laws, business deals, love poems, star charts, legal disputes, medical treatments, and yes, complaints. Ancient paperwork. Because apparently, humans have always loved bureaucracy. Here's what makes that so staggering. Before cuneiform, human knowledge was fragile, living inside individual minds, one fever or famine away from vanishing forever. Writing changed everything. Suddenly, ideas could survive their creators. Stories could travel to people who had never met the storyteller. Writing didn't just record civilization. It made civilization possible. And the Sumerians did it first. But they didn't stop there. The Sumerians also gave us the wheel, the plow, and the very way we measure time. That system of 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, that came from them. They built schools, real ones. They called them eduba, or tablet houses. Children would arrive at sunrise and study until sunset. Archaeologists have found clay tablets that look exactly like ancient homework. Math problems, grammar exercises, vocabulary lists. One student writing around 2000 BCE literally complained on his tablet that his teacher said his handwriting was bad. 6,000 years ago, kids were already getting roasted for messy handwriting. That's how deeply human this civilization was. And yet, despite inventing cities, writing, timekeeping, schools, and philosophy, the official story we inherited got almost everything about them wrong. Kramer spent 60 years trying to prove it. So what exactly did the official story get wrong? The myths we were taught. Here's the version most of us absorbed in school. The Sumerians were primitive and superstitious. Their gods were just wild myths, dramatic stories about divine beings fighting in the sky, because ancient people didn't understand science yet. Eventually, their civilization faded, replaced by bigger empires, and history moved on. Sumer was treated like the before picture of civilization, the rough draft, a stepping stone on the way to something better. But here's where things get deeply interesting. According to modern Sumeriologists, scholars who have dedicated entire careers to this question, that entire narrative is almost completely backwards. And the proof has been sitting in museums and excavation sites for years, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough. Let's start with the first big myth: Sumerian religion as superstition. For decades, historians assumed the Sumerian gods were imaginary characters, the ancient version of fantasy storytelling. But in 2023, researchers from the University of Vienna and the Oriental Institute of Chicago finished nearly a decade of re-examining more than 3,000 cuneiform tablets, many never properly translated before. What they discovered shocked the academic world. These tablets weren't mythology, they were cosmology, detailed, systematic attempts to understand how the universe actually worked. The Sumerians carefully tracked the movement of planets, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and cataloged stars with impressive accuracy. Some of these records later appeared in the famous MUL.APIN tablets, which modern astronomers have confirmed contain surprisingly precise astronomical calculations. These weren't superstitious people making up stories. They were decoding the rules governing existence. Kramer argued this for decades. Most of the academic establishment didn't want to hear it. In 2023, they finally ran out of reasons to disagree. And get this. The Sumerians wrote about something called the Me, pronounced May. The Me weren't religious commandments or simple moral rules. They were described as the fundamental principles of existence itself. Things like order, justice, truth, craftsmanship, music, leadership, the descent into the underworld, even the act of lighting a fire. More than 100 principles, carefully listed. For years, scholars brushed this off as poetic symbolism. But today, many researchers believe the Me represent one of the earliest attempts in human history to systematically identify the building blocks of civilization itself. That's not primitive thinking, that's philosophy. That's exactly what Aristotle and Plato would be doing 2,000 years later. Except the Sumerians got there first. And here's what makes it even more fascinating. The Me were treated as real, transferable things. Something that could be possessed, stolen, negotiated over. In one famous myth, the goddess Inanna tricks the god Enki into handing over the Me while he's drunk, then returns them to her city. The story sounds like mythology, but underneath it is a profound argument. The principles that hold society together are precious. They can be lost, and they must be passed on. But that myth, and the goddess at its center, are about to take us somewhere no one expected. The woman history forgot. Here's the second myth the textbooks got spectacularly wrong. People have long assumed that women in ancient civilizations had little to no real power, that they were invisible in the margins of history. Sumer tells a very different story. During the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, women held positions of genuine authority. One name stands above all others: Enheduanna. Remember that name. It's one of the most important in all of human history, and history buried it for centuries. She lived around 2285 BCE and served as the high priestess of the moon, god Nana, in the city of Ur. She was the daughter of the powerful ruler Sargon of Akkad, and she did something revolutionary. She wrote, not simple prayers, not administrative records. She composed 42 full temple hymns and a series of powerful, emotionally devastating poems dedicated to the goddess Inanna. Her writing was sophisticated, personal and breathtakingly alive across the millennia. And here's the catch: she signed them. She proudly attached her own name to her work, making Enheduanna the first known named author in all of human history. Not a king, not a general, a woman, a priestess, a poet. Think about what that means. Before Enheduanna, literature was anonymous. She changed that. She put her name on her work because she knew it mattered, because she believed what she made deserved to be remembered alongside its creator. And for centuries, historians barely mentioned her, treated like a small footnote. It wasn't until the 1970s that scholars began seriously re-examining her work. One passage, translated by scholar Betty DeShong Meador, captures Enheduanna stripped of her titles, exiled from her temple, raging at the injustice. She addresses the goddess Inanna directly, demanding that the powers of the universe pay attention. It reads less like a prayer and more like a protest. Scholars believe it's the first recorded instance of an individual calling out to a higher power, not out of devotion, but out of righteous anger. First author, first protest poem. Kramer spent years pushing the academic world to take her seriously. For most of his career, they treated her the same way history had. He died knowing she was finally being studied. Today, her hymn to Inanna is considered one of the earliest masterpieces of world literature. If this channel has ever shown you something that made you think, history forgot this person on purpose. Enheduanna is exactly why we do this. There are names buried in the past that changed everything. We exist to dig them back up. Subscribe now and hit the bell, because where we're going next, the names only get more buried and the secrets only get stranger. The drought that buried everything. Now, here's the third myth, the one about how Sumer ended. The standard. In explanation, a stronger empire defeated them. Sumer was weak, history moved on. But research from 2024 and 2025 has permanently changed that story. And what it reveals is devastating. A major study published in Nature used sediment cores drilled from the Persian Gulf, an isotope analysis of ancient soil, to reconstruct the region's climate thousands of years ago. What they found wasn't a military defeat. Around 2200 BCE, the entire Near East was struck by a massive, prolonged mega drought. Rainfall dropped by 30 to 40%. The Tigris and the Euphrates, the very lifelines of Sumerian civilization, began to shrink. Fields dried out, crops failed, food reserves vanished. Cities that had thrived for 1,000 years were abandoned within a single generation. The Sumerians didn't disappear because a stronger empire defeated them. They disappeared because the sky stopped giving them water. Kramer never lived to see the sediment core data, but he spent his career insisting Sumer didn't collapse from internal weakness. He was right. It just took geological drilling to prove it. And here's what that discovery leads directly to. Because the drought wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a secret archaeologists are only now uncovering. The golden age of rediscovery. Right now, something extraordinary is happening in archaeology. Experts are calling this the golden age of Mesopotamian rediscovery. And the reason is both fascinating and a little tragic. For decades, serious excavation in Iraq was nearly impossible. After the war began in 2003, ancient sites were looted, artifacts smuggled onto the black market, museums devastated. When the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was ransacked in April 2003, more than 15,000 priceless objects vanished in a single night. 15,000 pieces of human history, gone overnight. Since around 2018, as parts of southern Iraq stabilized, international teams were finally allowed to return. And once they started digging, the discoveries started coming fast. Take the rediscovery of Lagash. Beginning in 2019, a joint Iraqi-American team reopened the site. At first, they expected the usual: temples, pottery, a few tablets. Instead, they uncovered a massive administrative complex packed with thousands of untranslated clay tablets. Then, in 2025, came the announcement nobody saw coming. When researchers worked through part of the archive, they weren't looking at royal decrees or military records. They were looking at something far more surprising: a social welfare system. 4,000 years ago, the tablets recorded food rations distributed to elderly citizens, sick individuals, and orphaned children. Not as charity, but as something structured and official. documents carefully listing names, quantities, and dates, like entries in a modern government database. Rations were precise. Bread and beer delivered regularly to those who could no longer work. Around 2100 BCE, a city in ancient Mesopotamia had already decided that people shouldn't starve simply because they were old, sick, or alone. They built a system to prevent it, and somehow we spent centuries calling these people primitive. Kramer cataloged 39 firsts attributable to Sumerian civilization. He never had this one. The tablets were sitting in the ground, waiting. But the Lagash discovery isn't even the most mind-bending thing that's happened, because another breakthrough came from somewhere nobody expected. The machine that reads the past, artificial intelligence. In 2024, researchers working alongside Google DeepMind partnered with the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative to build an AI model designed specifically to read ancient cuneiform tablets. Especially the damaged ones, human scholars had struggled for decades to piece together. The system, nicknamed Ashurbanipal-1 during testing, reconstructed broken texts with approximately 78% accuracy. Some tablets take human experts years to interpret. The AI processed them in minutes. Within its first year, researchers used the model to analyze more than 22,000 tablets from the British Museum's collection. Many had been sitting in storage drawers for over 150 years, unread, untouched, waiting. And among those forgotten tablets, they found something that stopped the entire research team cold. Previously unknown sections of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories ever written. When scholars translated one newly reconstructed passage in early 2025, they found a moment that felt shockingly modern. Instead of heroic battles or legendary adventures, the great king Gilgamesh is grieving the death of his closest friend Enkidu. In the passage, he admits something painfully human. He believed he was strong enough to handle the loss, but he wasn't. He sat with the body of his friend and refused to accept what had happened. He bargained, he raged, he fell apart. Gilgamesh, the legendary, supposedly invincible, hero of ancient Sumer, sitting alone in his grief, learning that strength doesn't protect you from the people you lose. 4,000 years ago, and it still lands. Here's what nobody has said yet. That passage sat in a British museum drawer for over 150 years. It was there, waiting to be read. Just like everything Kramer spent his life arguing, sitting in plain sight, waiting for the world to finally look. But there's one more discovery, and this one might be the most explosive of all. The flood that actually happened. Most people know the story of Noah's Ark, but what many don't realize is that an almost identical flood story appears in Sumerian texts, at least 1,000 years earlier. Ancient works like the Epic of Atrahasis and the Eridu Genesis describe a catastrophic flood sent by the gods. One man receives a divine warning. He builds a boat. He survives. He helps restart life. Sound familiar? For a long time, historians debated whether these were purely symbolic, myths. But in 2025, new geological research added an unexpected twist. Scientists conducted deep core drilling at the site of Shuruppak, the ancient city directly linked to the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra. The sediment layers revealed unmistakable evidence of a massive flooding event around 2900 BCE. This wasn't a flood that covered the entire planet, but in the flat river plains of Mesopotamia, it would have spread across hundreds of miles. To the people who lived there, the only world they had ever known, it would have looked exactly like the end of everything. And get this, when the Sumerians wrote about a catastrophic flood destroying their world, they may not have been inventing mythology at all. They may have been doing something far more human. They were remembering, which brings us back to the hospital room, and the man in the bed, and what he was really trying to say. What Dr. Kramer was really saying. Dr. Samuel Noah Kramer spent more than 6 decades translating Sumerian tablets, decoding thousands of texts nobody had read in 4,000 years. He wrote the landmark book, History Begins at Sumer, cataloging 39 major human firsts traceable to Sumerian civilization. He gave lectures, published papers, argued with colleagues, and spent a lifetime trying to get the world to look at what was actually written in those tablets, not what it was convenient to assume. He had watched scholars dismiss the me as poetic fantasy, He had watched Enheduanna buried in footnotes for most of his career. He had argued for decades that Sumerian religion was not superstition, it was systematic cosmological inquiry. He had insisted Sumer's collapse was not weakness. One by one, the evidence proved him right. When he pressed his cracked lips together in that hospital room and said we had been lying to the world about the Sumerians, this is what he meant. We inherited a version of history that flattened one of humanity's greatest stories into a footnote. We called them primitive because they were old. We called their science mythology because it was expressed in the language of gods. We buried their greatest poet under centuries of silence because she was a woman. We blamed their collapse on weakness when it was catastrophe. And in doing all of that, we missed the point entirely. The Sumerians weren't a stepping stone. They were a destination. A civilization that reached extraordinary heights of philosophical sophistication, literary expression, astronomical precision, and social organization that the ancient world would not see again for centuries. They looked up at the same stars we look at today and asked the very same questions we are still asking. They grieved the same losses. They feared the same endings and the same uncertainties. They built things intended to outlast themselves. And they did outlast themselves. In clay. In the thousands of tablets still being translated today, still being pulled out of storage, drawers in museums around the world, still being reconstructed by artificial intelligence letter by crumbling letter. The Sumerians are still speaking. We are only just now learning to listen. If you want to keep uncovering the forgotten secrets of human history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what we find next. Because history still has more buried than we ever imagined. And we are just getting started.